Auschwitz wurde niemand umgebracht. Und ich sage es klipp und klar, leider wurde niemand umgebracht.
In the slipstream of the capitalist crisis, and with the support of crucial parts of the state itself, Nazism has been growing stronger in the Federal Republic of Germany almost unhindered for several years. The far-right AfD party, with openly fascist elements, is growing quickly and establishing itself as a dominant player nationwide. Parts of the right are talking more frequently about fascist coups or the Rassenkrieg, the race war, and their entanglements deep into the state apparatus are becoming public again and again. The increasing right-wing terror against migrants and other minorities creates a climate of fear and insecurity. Meanwhile, the state is ramping up its repression against those fighting against Nazism to suffocate rising awareness and resistance in its infancy. Some weeks ago, anti-fascist Lina E received over 5 years for alleged attacks against neo-Nazis, and this after a series of revelations showing the complicity of the state in the creation of a secret far-right network. In order to understand the developments in Germany, it is crucial to know about how and why Nazism managed to stay alive, and therefore to learn about the so-called period of denazification after World War II, where, far from eliminating Nazi influence, Nazism was deliberately spared and reintegrated into the new West German power structure, where it managed to survive to this day. Before I start, I just want to quickly say a huge thank you to all those who support the channel on Patreon, which I set up after my last video on Turkish fascism. Doing all the research and editing takes up a huge amount of time, and your contributions really make a difference. Thank you. Most people have heard about the top Nazi leaders such as Hermann Göring and Rudolf Hess being prosecuted after the defeat of Nazi Germany in the famous Nuremberg trials. What is less well known is that West German denazification was an utter failure when it comes to thoroughly punishing Nazis in the several trials that were conducted at the time. From 1946 until 2005, after absorbing the GDR, the Federal Republic of Germany convicted 6,656 people of Nazi crimes, and the vast majority of sentences, just under 5,000, were relatively mild, involving imprisonment of up to 2 years. Note that this is a teeny-tiny fraction of the over 200,000 perpetrators of Nazi crimes. Picture this. The number of individuals convicted for Nazi crimes under the Federal Republic was lower than the total number of Nazis who had worked at Auschwitz alone. Up until the end of the 20th century, only 164 Nazis were eventually sentenced for murder, compared to the hundreds of thousands of individuals complicit in the massacre of 6 million Jews in the Holocaust. And I want you to keep in mind that anti-fascist Lina E got over 5 years in prison for allegedly beating up Nazis, while the vast majority of those convicted, literal participants in the Nazi killing machine, didn't even receive 2 years. The half-assed denazification efforts didn't cause outrage among all people in Germany. If anything, a considerable amount of the population who remained in denial about the Nazi crimes opposed these efforts, dismissing the Nuremberg trials conducted by foreign powers as victors' justice. Germany was once again portrayed as the victim. This is no surprise, since a large section of the German population had been supporters of Hitler. 43.9% had voted for the Nazi Party in 1933, with some estimating an even higher percentage of support in the 40s, and they did not turn anti-fascist all of a sudden after the war. Before the state pushed for amnesty a few years later, It was a large section of civil society that helped the Nazis with legal assistance or with smuggling them out of the country. It was the Catholic and the Protestant churches that represented one of the few structural constants immediately after the war ended. The International Red Cross provided the fleeing Nazis with passports. Among those who left illegally were Adolf Eichmann, one of the main architects of the Holocaust, Auschwitz doctor and angel of death, Josef Mengele, the former head of the Lyon Gestapo, Klaus Barbie, otherwise known as the Butcher of Lyon, or Ante Pavelic, Croatian founder of the Nazi collaborating Ustaše. The US Counterintelligence Corps, which was informed about the identity of the perpetrators, helped with the escape. In Barbie, they had found one of their top assets in the hunt for communists. With the help of the Americans, Barbie managed to escape to Bolivia, where he would play a key role in hunting down Che Guevara. 4 years earlier, CIC man Vincent Lavista had described the Vatican as the, quote, largest single organization involved in the illegal movement of immigrants. Through so-called rat lines, Nazis would be smuggled out of Germany through Switzerland to South America, for instance. All with the knowledge of the Church, the Swiss government, and President of Argentina, Juan Perón, with companies such as the predecessor of the Swiss corporation Emschemi actively collaborating in this endeavor. But things didn't stop there. Describing denazification simply as a series of government mistakes or slackness misses the point. In order to fight the danger of communism from without and within Germany, among other things, the West German government saw great benefits in not only sparing the Nazis, but in reintegrating them in the state apparatus. Accordingly, the Nazi ideology continued to have significant influence in the power structure. Anti-communism, which was strongly intertwined with anti-Semitism, served the needs of the new regime. In particular, it was the phantom of the Red Orchestra, which influential Nazis took over from the Gestapo. Communist resistance to Hitler was unquestionably labeled as treason, and it was successfully insinuated that it was now having a stronger effect in the Federal Republic of Germany. It's important to remember that many representatives of the ruling classes in other countries didn't have a problem with fascism in general, but only where fascism endangered their own sphere of influence. Communism was the main danger to capitalism, and fascism was correctly regarded as an effective tool against communist influence. Quote, "Fascism has rendered a service to the whole world. Hereafter, no great nation will be unprovided with an ultimate means of protection against the cancerous growth of Bolshevism," said Winston Churchill in a speech he gave in Rome in 1927. So instead of describing denazification as a failure, we have to see the adoption of fascism as a logical consequence of class society, whether it's fascism in the form of an actual government system or the use of the fascist movement in the service of capital, e.g., either actively collaborating with the Freikorps or the Fasci to crush communists, or just integrating fascist elements in the state apparatus, such as the police, whether consciously or unconsciously, to secure a counter-revolutionary basis for the worst case. In other words, you cannot denazify class society. But this deeper causation and involvement of much wider forces in society was left aside, of course, in the World War II aftermath. Fritz Bauer, the Attorney General who set the Auschwitz trial in motion, spoke of the atomization and parceling of the collective event, which had thus been diffused and privatized. This is reflected in the punishing of a relatively minuscule selective set of people, the tip of the iceberg. Take all the companies and their bosses who had financed Hitler's rise to power, who collaborated with the Nazi regime and profited from forced labor and mass murder in the concentration camps. The Thyssens, the Flicks, the Quants, the Porsche Piechs, the Oetkers, most of them faced little to zero consequences. Industrialist Günther Quandt, whose ex-wife was married to Joseph Goebbels, expanded the family wealth at the expense of concentration camp prisoners or through expropriating competitors, mostly Jewish, and became a major producer of armaments and industrial goods, boosting the war machine of the Third Reich. However, No charges were brought against him at the Nuremberg trials, despite initial investigations. The Quants are the wealthiest family in Germany today. Among the roughly 100 most powerful businessmen who virtually ruled over West German capitalism in the 60s, a majority were the same people as before 1945, people who should have been punished for war crimes. I will dive deeper into the collaboration between capitalists and Hitler in a future video. Nazism this, Nazism that, Nazis, Nazis, Nazis. The West German ruling class got sick of hearing about denazification over and over. They've had enough of it. Schluss mit Entnazifizierung, end denazification, was a campaign slogan of the FDP, which is part of the so-called center-left government coalition in Germany today. But the big winner of the 1949 election was another party, Konrad Adenauer, from the Conservative Christian Democratic Union, short CDU, was elected as the first Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany. The CDU is the largest conservative party in Germany. President of the European Commission Ursula von der Leyen is a member. A year later in 1950, Adenauer and former officers met in Himmerod Abbey to lay out the conditions for the rearmament of Western Germany, releasing war criminals, putting an end to the defamation of the former soldiers, and the need to change public opinion regarding the Wehrmacht. US President Eisenhower, who had previously called the Wehrmacht soldiers Nazis, would suddenly change his opinion, perpetuating the clean Wehrmacht myth and supporting the rearmament efforts, not least because the Yankees needed strong partners in the Korean War and in the fight against communism more broadly. The US soon deemed denazification as counterproductive and agreed with Adenauer in ending denazification efforts. The Chancellor said that the main culprits had already been prosecuted. After all, there were much bigger problems than Nazis in Germany in the eyes of the new German government. Stoking the fear of the Red Menace, Adenauer would say, quote, "In a moment you will hear a cabinet resolution that we passed this morning, the aim of which is to ruthlessly remove all supporters of communism from positions in the Federal Republic, whether they are workers, employees, or civil servants." The context was a resolution that the new government passed in 1950 called the Decree Against Enemies of the Constitution, or the so-called Adenauer Decree. While it's worded neutrally, its thrust was clear. Of the organizations named in it, 11 are communist, but only 2 are right-wing extremists. The decree was the prelude to further legal measures against the left-wing opposition. Adenauer targeted not only the Communist Party of Germany and its sympathizers, but also popular resistance to the remilitarization that he sought. While persecuting communists, Nazis were slowly but surely led back to occupying key positions in the new German state. Not only did denazification stop, but it was deemed as having gone too far. So, one of the first things that the Adenauer administration did was to pass amnesty laws, reducing the sentences of around 800,000 people, or even setting them free, including thousands of SA, SS, and Nazi Party members who had been convicted for assault or murder and for actively taking part in the transportation of victims to concentration camps. Among the many Nazi military leaders who were reintegrated into the West German army was Adolf Heusinger, who had served as an operations chief in the Wehrmacht. He later became the head of the West German military and the chairman of the NATO Military Committee. The chief of staff of the German Chancellery, the quote, left and right hand of Adenauer, Hans Globke, had written the commentary on the Nuremberg race laws, which determined who was a Jew, thus deciding who was persecuted and who was locked up in concentration camps. He now said, quote, "The German people knew as little as I did." Then there were those Nazis who were key people in the foundation of international bodies, such as Walter Hallstein, who became one of the founding fathers of the European Union, and Kurt Waldheim, who became Secretary General of the United Nations and President of Austria. And of course there were Nazis in the universities as well. Historian and fierce anti-Semite Werner Conze is among them, but also the rector of the University of Freiburg and one of the most influential German philosophers, Martin Heidegger. Heidegger never apologized for his support of the Nazis. He joined the party in 1933 and remained there until the bitter end. After 1945, there was a massive campaign to salvage Heidegger's reputation, claiming that he had been critical of the Nazis all along, but that he couldn't state it openly. All of that fell apart in 2014 at the latest, when the Black Notebooks were released. And let's not forget the so-called assault gun of democracy, one of the biggest German news magazines, Der Spiegel, co-designed for far too long by old men of the Nazi regime. One of the vice editors-in-chief was a certain Georg Wolf, former SS Hauptsturmführer and SA member. These examples are only a fraction of all the Nazis holding powerful positions in the police, in government and all the ministries, or in the judicial system. And don't get the wrong impression that Nazis only occupied supportive secondary offices. No, they were part of the highest echelons of power. The later Chancellor of Germany, Kurt Georg Kiesinger, had been a Nazi Party member from 1933. Kiesinger would accelerate the reintegration of Nazis and would successfully campaign against the banning of the NPD, a neo-Nazi party that exists to this day. Meanwhile, the Communist Party of Germany was banned in 1956, the second and last ban in the history of the Federal Republic, followed by over 125,000 prosecutorial investigations and around 10,000 convictions, reaffirming that within a bourgeois democracy, the communist is seen as a far greater danger than the Nazi. I'll talk more about the persecution of communists and the broader left in Western Germany in the next part. With the exception of Gustav Heinemann, all German presidents from Theodor Heuss to Roman Herzog were contaminated by National Socialism. They had been either members of the Nazi Party or the Wehrmacht, and included a concentration camp builder or a profiteer from forced labor in those camps. And it wasn't only guys from the conservative parties. Rabid anti-communist SPD Chancellor from 1974, Helmut Schmidt, had received 7 Nazi awards for his engagement in Hitler's army, and had also been described by superiors as having a, quote, impeccable National Socialist attitude. Just take a moment to digest this. This isn't just utilizing a few former Nazi members for their know-how. This isn't just marginal elements of Nazism that survived. This is structural. A certain Otto John, who was the first chief of the German Domestic Intelligence Agency, had enough and ranted against the, quote, renazification in West Germany, and then quit his job. His successor was a former Nazi, but more on that next time. Professor Albert Norden from the GDR published the seminal Brown Book in 1965, covering around 2,000 powerful people in Western Germany with a Nazi past, including 100 admirals and generals, 15 ministers, 828 judges or state attorneys, 245 officials in the Foreign Office and at embassies, 297 high police officers and members of the so-called Verfassungsschutz, protection of the Constitution. This one is important. We'll talk about the Verfassungsschutz in the next part. The West German government seized the book on a book fair and claimed that it was all falsification and, quote, communist propaganda. However, the communist propaganda in question turned out to be largely correct. And bit by bit, research in the coming decades would uncover more and more about the Nazi structures existing within the Federal Republic. The response of the West German government was to point out how Nazis were reintegrated in the East as well. And you'll hear this line of defense today as well from liberals and conservatives. What about East Germany, they'll ask. Now, to be sure, it is true that former NSDAP members found their way into the East German state as well. But the comparison is laughable. Denazification in the Soviet zone had been a much higher priority, even to the point of being criticized as being too harsh. Large landowners and the so-called Junkers, who were also often former Nazi supporters, were quickly expropriated in the East, while West German parties started to urge the Allied powers to stop denazification. It was not until years later when the West German politicians started pointing the finger back to the East. In fact, a huge amount of Nazis fled to the West, convinced they would get away with much less punishment. And they were right. A total of 12,890 sentences were passed in East Germany, almost double the number in the West, despite East Germany having less than 1/3 of the population of West Germany, and that despite the massive transfer of Nazis from East to West. Former Nazis in East Germany were 6 to 7 times more likely to be prosecuted and found guilty than their Western counterparts. Furthermore, not only were former Nazis more likely to be prosecuted in East Germany, but they also faced much harsher punishments if convicted. And lastly, Nazis were represented to a much larger degree at the very top of the political and economic hierarchy than in the East. And this will become very clear throughout this series. In the German Democratic Republic, individuals recognized as fighters or victims of fascism were provided with additional pensions and other privileges as a way to acknowledge their suffering. On the other hand, Nazis were granted generous pensions in the West, while those who had fought against the Nazis and were interned in concentration camps received no pensions for those periods because they were considered not to have made the necessary contributions during that time. Now, I have my criticism of the GDR's development over the decades, and this will likely be the subject of another video. What I want to stress here is that this deflection to the East is a cheap excuse to distract from the very real and consequential problems existing in Germany today. Many people seem to think that modern, so-called United Germany is a new, third thing. It's not. The Bundesrepublik Deutschland is the state apparatus of West Germany. And yet, liberals are perpetually in a rush to demonize the specter of communism for all their problems, including the rise of the AfD, but this will be discussed in one of the next parts. SS Commander Herbert Kappler, who was head of German police and security services in Rome during the war, had organized a massacre of 335 Italians in 1944 by shot in the neck. For this, he was sentenced to life imprisonment in Italy. What is less well known is how politicians like the Social Democrat Chancellor Willy Brandt campaigned for his pardon. Brandt's goal was to pursue a policy of so-called internal reconciliation, reconciling former Nazi followers and opponents of the Third Reich. The West German government appealed for a release of Kappler, which the Italian authorities denied. However, in 1976, he was transferred to a hospital where he managed to escape, likely with the help of a carabinieri. Despite calls for his extradition back to Italy, the West German authorities refused and did not prosecute Kappler for any additional war crimes, citing his poor health as the reason. Kappler died peacefully in 1978. And it was not until decades later, after most of the Nazi Party members had died in peace, when the West German authorities made a half-hearted effort to investigate renazification. A 2012 study by the Federal Ministry of Justice itself found that a whopping 77% of its senior officials in 1957 were former NSDAP members, more than researchers expected. And their number even increased after 1949. Historians also found that, up to the 70s, over 80% of top judicial officials had worked in Hitler's justice apparatus, among them those who had handed down death sentences during the Holocaust. And in 2014, almost 70 years after the fall of Hitler, the Federal Ministry of the Interior also finally commissioned a group of historians to investigate its past, with depressing results. Between 1949 and 1970, the proportion of former Nazi members was 54%. Among them, the lawyer Gerhard Scheffler, who had already served in the Reich Ministry of the Interior in the 30s. During the war, he was responsible for the Germanization of businesses and organized the deportation of Poles and Jews to ghettos. He reappeared in 1950 in the Federal Ministry of the Interior, from 1955 as head of the Social Department, where he was instrumental in preparing the Bundessozialhilfegesetz, the Federal Social Assistance Act. So this of course had a great impact on German politics. The most striking case was that of the head of the Residence and Asylum Law Department, Kurt Breuil, who had never abandoned his fundamental anti-Semitic attitude and who was then responsible for rejecting Jews who had fled from Germany. Note that this is the ministry which is tasked with the quote-unquote protection of democracy and things such as media and cultural policy. Regarding the Nazis that were reintegrated into the Federal Foreign Office, Adenauer said, quote, "You can't build a foreign office if you don't have people, at least initially in these senior positions, who understand something about the history of the past." Out of 17 diplomats who sat in the political department at the time, 13 had previously held NSDAP party membership cards. If we are to believe German state propaganda, Germany successfully denazified society and established an effective memory culture, Erinnerungskultur, a culture of dealing with its Nazi past so as to not risk repeating history. As I hope to show with this video, as also confirmed by recent events, most of that narrative is bullshit. According to a poll, over half of Germans want to move on from remembering the country's Nazi past. Among AfD voters, it's 80%. A chilling 58% of the supporters of the increasingly successful far-right party further stated that Nazi Germany had its positives. But what about today? Surely, now that the old Nazis have died off, there's no chance that there's significant fascist influence in a democratic state such as Germany today. Well, you thought wrong. It was one structure in particular which would become one of the most important pillars in the West German state, being a core node of a secret counter-revolutionary Nazi network that's in existence to this day. It is this crucial building block of the German capitalist bureaucracy I deliberately left out in this part because it deserves its own video. So, in the next part, we'll analyze the history of an organization led by none other than the former Wehrmacht general and Nazi military intelligence chief in the Eastern Front, a notorious hunter of communists, recruited by the CIA to build an organization that would turn into one of the most important anti-communist intelligence agencies in the world, the Organisation Gehlen.